But now I want to turn things over to our Deputy Secretary, Tracy Campanini. She's the Deputy Secretary of the Office of Child Development and Early Learning, and she has some welcoming remarks for us.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to join the call here at the beginning of the call to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to join Sarah and Gina on this call for preschool early intervention. And I always just like to start with, I'm surprised, and it's especially been called to attention here as we've been beginning to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, that people don't necessarily realize that our office, the Office of Child Development and Early Learning, works with, as an office, to both the Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. And we've been working very closely with both of them as they're really concerned about what this coronavirus, or COVID-19 as we like to call it, is doing to impact the Pennsylvania citizens, and especially our youngest citizens. You know, we've been thinking about the impacts of COVID-19 since the beginning of March. And as this epidemic has come into Pennsylvania, the governor, along with all of the department heads, have been really taking their direction from the Secretary of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, as she's been providing us updates and giving us recommendations about how we can safely mitigate the spread of COVID-19, as well as how we can keep our children, our families, and our staff safe as well. As we are thinking about this, we are certainly in times that we never anticipated planning for or being in as we thought about sort of what a crisis situation was. And so I think one of the things I just wanted to share with you, as we've worked to try to communicate and provide information to providers and families about how quickly we're trying to be responsive to changing information, it's important to us to have feedback from providers, from families, from our staff about how we can implement these services at this time in a better fashion. So we're certainly entering into a time period, or we've been here for the past couple weeks, where we've been implementing some innovations that I think are pretty exciting. And this is our opportunity to hear back from you through the rest of the webinar about how things are impacting you and your families as we think about early intervention services. So again, I want to thank the families that took time out of their day. I'm sure with little ones at home, it's a little troubling or challenging to juggle your schedule to join us. For the professionals out there that support families every day, thank you for joining as well to hear some of the updates and feedbacks from families. And to Sarah, Gina, and the early intervention staff that work to support implementing these processes as well, just a hearty thank you for the work that you're doing. And we just appreciate people's understanding as we work to figure out how to best serve young children in the system. So with that, Sarah and Gina, I'm going to turn it back to you, and good luck on the rest of your webinar, and I hope everybody gets some meaningful information out of it.
Thanks so much, Trace. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. And again, welcome, and thanks so much for joining everybody who's on the phone or on the Zoom, I guess. So I also wanted to let folks know that we have a bunch of other folks that are supporting us in front and behind the scenes. And I wanted folks to know that our Director of Early Intervention Services and Family Supports, Carl Beck, is with us, as well as Division Chief Deborah Knoll is also with us. And there's Carl's shining fun face and wave. He learned that from the Queen. Was a very good wave, Carl. Are here to join us, and they will certainly be helping to support me as we share some information, as well as monitoring the chat. So again, for those of you that have questions, we encourage you to use the chat feature. We have folks that, that are monitoring that. Carl and Deb will be responding to the questions, particularly those that have to do with services and supports in early intervention. We also have our Director of Early Intervention Service, or Early Intervention Technical Assistance, on with us. Deb Dalton, as well as other early intervention technical assistance folks are also with us to help monitor the chat, answer questions, and our behind the scenes support. You'll probably hear me sort of referring to her throughout today. Gina Federico is sort of helping manage our waiting room and participants and pulling up polls. So she is with us as well. So thanks so much for joining. Let's get started. A little bit about what we're going to do today really quickly. What we hope is by the end of our session today, we hope to end around 3 o'clock. We went a little bit over before, but we're going to try to keep this as tight as possible. We want you to understand some of the current guidance that's provided to opt out early childhood programs in addition to early intervention, as Trace had mentioned earlier. We obviously are going to be spending the majority of our time talking about early intervention and services provided within early intervention during this time of COVID-19. We want to make sure that you are familiar with and sort of have some tools and ideas of how you can best partner with your early intervention program at this time to determine services, and also get some additional information for where you can go for help and additional resources. So I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about guidance that's been provided, as well as our governor, to our other early childhood programs. So for those of you that are using childcare or used childcare prior to the COVID-19 mitigation efforts, or for those of you that may know of people or you yourself are in need of childcare during this time, folks probably know by now childcare centers were mandated to be closed by the governor in March. However, it also is recognized that childcare is a service that is needed by many families now across the Commonwealth because they work in life-sustaining operations. So childcare centers were able to apply for a waiver if they serve those essential personnel. And we have granted a number of waivers across the state. If you are in need of childcare, or again, know of somebody who is, you can find information about the childcares that are currently open. They are working very hard to keep this list updated, but the link that you see there, you can use that to find childcare. Also, family childcare and group childcare operating out of residences were not covered in the governor's mandate for closure. Some of those programs may still be open. And again, these are small programs operating out of private residences. Many of them did close, but some of them are remaining open again to serve those essential workers. If you are a family that's utilizing childcare right now, we just want to give you a quick reminder to make sure that you make sure that your contact information and emergency contact information is up to date and correct. As always, work on having a backup plan. It is possible that childcare centers may need to close as the situation evolves. If you have questions about childcare, if you are a family whose child is receiving childcare subsidy, which is tuition assistance to help pay for the cost of childcare. In Pennsylvania, we call that Childcare Works. If you have any questions about your child's childcare subsidy, or questions about how to access childcare works during this time, our early learning resource centers, which are hubs that are located across the Commonwealth, are still available to help support families. If you don't know who your early learning resource center is or how to contact them, the website that is on your screen is available to help you find your early learning resource center. And that website is www.raiseyourstar.org. And maybe one of my EITA friends or somebody else wouldn't mind putting that website in the chat in case folks need to access that. So we know that families that have children in early intervention receive their services in lots of different places. In some families, their children may be attending a Pennsylvania Pre-K Counts classroom or a Head Start classroom. For those that are state funded, so our Pennsylvania Pre-K Counts programs and our Head Start state supplemental programs, OCDEL has provided guidance to those programs to reach out to families or to provide support to families as they are able. These programs primarily are also all shut down, so they are not providing face-to-face services or classroom services. And again, if your kids are in there, you know that. There are a couple programs that also operate childcare and then have remained open again to serve those essential workers. But for the most part, Pre-K Counts and Head Start supplemental programs are closed. They have been asked to continue to support enrolled children and families in creative and innovative ways. Services during closures include things like providing meals, some home education or home learning activities. So again, nothing face-to-face, but some programs were able to provide some ideas of how families can support their child's development and learning at home and family engagement. So this is going to look different for these programs across the state. We ask if you have a child in one of these programs and they have reached out to you, reach back and see what they can do to help support you during this time. And let your EI folks know if you are receiving any support or assistance through those other programs, just to help coordinate those services. Home visiting as well is not operating in a face-to-face way, but is operating. Our home visiting programs are reaching out to families and again, finding unique and innovative ways to help support them. So again, if your child is in a home visiting program as well, we encourage you to utilize those services in ways that make sense for your family. I'm going to take a quick pause and just take a deep breath as we sort of move into the portion of our session that I know most of you probably joined for today. And this is to talk a little bit about the guidance that's been provided to your local early intervention preschool programs. And I want to start by saying just a couple things in terms of how at the Office of Child Development and Early Learning, as well as certainly at the Bureau, we're sort of thinking through services and supports during this time. The first thing is, and at the forefront, and this isn't new to this time, but it is definitely of utmost importance at this time, is that decisions really should be guided by what's best for children and their families. And we know what's best for children and their families may not look the same for every child and for every family. Although we are having some shared experiences at this time, we are all being asked to social distance. We are all being asked to only leave our homes if we absolutely have to. What we also know is that COVID-19 is affecting families in different ways. And so we realize that families really do need to lead the efforts around what makes sense to them and what do they need and what would be helpful. Again, this isn't new, but as always, we want early intervention services and supports to be a support. We don't want them to be one more thing that causes stress, anxiety, or frustration. So we really want families to work together with their early intervention teams to think about what makes sense for them. We know that we will all be learning together. I don't think that anybody that is with us today has lived through providing and receiving early intervention services during a pandemic. We really are in a new place right now. What we are experiencing is not a normal situation. And so as a result, we know that we're all going to be learning together, and we may have a couple missteps or hiccups along the way. But the goal is that we keep those lines of communication open and that we really work together to help work through them. Speaking of communication, we know that communication, partnership, and flexibility are going to be so important during this time. I feel really strongly that these things are important all of the time. But in times of stress, in times when you're learning new things and you're trying to figure out new ways of doing what you have to do, that keeping communication open and really working together in partnership with those that you're choosing to have support you, and having that flexibility with each other is going to be really important. I also recognize and understand that in times of stress and challenge, these are often the things that get even harder. So we're going to need to have a little bit of grace with each other. And certainly for the families out there, I really encourage you to give yourself all the grace that you can. These are challenging times in navigating not just your early intervention services and supports, but life in general right now can be challenging and probably is challenging for a lot of folks. So we encourage you to work together, talk to each other, and reach out for support when you need it. So big picture, again, as I'm sure everybody knows, early intervention has ceased face-to-face services. What is available to our families in our early intervention program, both infant toddler and preschool program, are what we are calling tele-intervention services. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what they are in a minute. I wanted to share just really broadly some information around referrals, evaluation, and transition. For those of you that may be concerned about families that don't know about early intervention yet or just learned about early intervention, our Connect statewide information and referral line is still operational and is still able to accept those early intervention referrals and then send them to the local program so that programs can move through their referral process. So know that families are still able to be referred to early intervention, both our infant toddler and our preschool program. And OCDEL has requested that programs move through their referral, their evaluation, and those transition processes to the best of their abilities at this time. We know that there's going to be challenges. We know that it may be challenging to work within our typical timelines for our early intervention program. But we have been finding some successes, particularly I've heard some really great successes around evaluation and how evaluation teams have been able to still meet with families and children virtually. So certainly not breaking any of our social distancing guidelines. Early intervention technical assistance has been gathering information from publishers of our standardized assessments that are used across Pennsylvania and providing that information to local early intervention programs so that they can think about how they can still continue with evaluation, again, as much as possible. And again, transition activities. I know that there are probably families with us today who are looking at that transition to kindergarten, which is a big thing all the time. It was a big thing before COVID-19. It may feel like an even bigger thing right now. And just know that at this point, this is about the time where school districts, the school district that your child would be entering in, sort of starts to take the lead. As you know, our schools are closed at this time, which may cause some bumps in the road around transition. But our early intervention programs have been provided just some guidance on how to help support families in that transition. And mostly that's going to be helping families navigate and connect to their school districts. So I'm going to pause and just see if Carl had anything to add, Carl or Deb Knoll had anything to add at this point before we move on. Trying.
Nothing specifically. I think the transition process, we're working with our partners within the Department of Education regarding transition process and trying to make that process a little simpler this year in terms of some of the expectations around the evaluation process. And that guidance will be coming out. So we are definitely looking at that, how we can help our local programs and school districts address that. As well, there's a number of questions about, there are a few questions about not being able to reach people. I did put on in the chat box the specific email account. If you're not able to get a hold of a supervisor, or you've kind of lost contact with your EI professional, early intervention professional, you can email us and we will try to help navigate with you to resolve your issues. And right now, that's all I've seen so far, Sarah.
Great. Okay. So let's keep going then. So what we're going to sort of talk about during this chunk of time is we want to share a little bit more with you about what do we mean by teleintervention. So what is teleintervention? A little bit more information about how you should or could be working with your early intervention team around services being provided during this time, and what services could look like, and also what to do if you have questions or concerns. So a couple things to note. We do recognize that this is a time that's not normal. So as a result, your services may look different at this time. Your family needs may be different at this time. So we just want to make sure that families are aware of what, for lack of a better word, their options are, and just provide some ideas of how they might want to think about navigating their early intervention services at this time. So because things aren't complicated enough, we have to add a new term to our world. And it even comes with its own acronym, of course. And that is the term teleintervention, or TI for short. And basically what we mean by teleintervention is the delivery of early intervention services using audio and/or video technology, which are usually computers, cell phones, or tablets, when the early interventionist and a family are not in the same physical location. So again, we know at this point, that's where we all are. We are not in the same physical location with our folks that are providing early intervention services. And so at this point, early intervention services are able to be provided through teleintervention. And that includes both our infant toddler and our preschool programs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by that, or what they can look like. You know what, and maybe before we do that, I just jumped ahead. We actually wanted to do a little poll. And again, this poll is for families that are currently receiving early intervention preschool services. So again, this is for our families in our preschool program. We want to know if you've heard from somebody from your child's preschool team, if they've connected with you, and if you've had an opportunity to discuss services and supports during this time. If you have, if you're being provided some teleintervention services, and if you're not receiving teleintervention services, is it because you declined the services at this time? So again, this poll is just for our families. We ask our professionals to not respond to this poll, please. Give it a little bit longer because it seems like we have folks still responding. I'll give you about 10 more seconds before I share. And if there are folks that just joined, again, this is a poll for families receiving preschool early intervention services. I'm going to go ahead and end our poll, share the results. So it looks like most families have had an opportunity to work with somebody from their early intervention preschool team around services and supports. Looks like some folks have started receiving teleintervention services. That's great. And then it looks like, you know, some folks are not, and there's a variety of reasons why. It looks like some folks may have declined at this point, and other folks have not. So hopefully you're going to learn a few ways to sort of enter into those conversations with your early intervention preschool program so that you can think about what services may be appropriate for you at this time to be provided through teleintervention. And also feel free to use the chat. If your child isn't receiving teleintervention services, but perhaps you've had communication from your early intervention preschool program around other types of supports that they are providing, you can feel free to let us know that as well. And we know that some of our preschool programs, a first step was just to reach out to families and provide maybe some resource information. I know some of our preschool programs have provided things like information about things families can do at home to support their child's development. So again, feel free to let us know that if you have received those types of communications. We also know that for our preschool programs, you know, there are some added complexities to sort of getting early intervention services up and running. Many of our kids receive services, one in other locations, childcare locations, preschool locations that are now closed. Many of our services are provided in group type settings that folks are trying to navigate around. How do we work on in these environments? So a little bit of just sort of nuts and bolts around how teleintervention can be delivered. First of all, platforms that can be used. So those of you that are with us today are on a Zoom platform. This is one of the platforms that can be used for teleintervention. Zoom, Skype, trying to think of a few others. Hold on one second for my notes. Skype, FaceTime, Facebook has a video messenger app that can be used as well. These are non-publicly facing platforms, and these are available to use for our families in early intervention that have access to them. So again, most families, or not most, but many families already have access to a device that they can use, and either they may have used some of these platforms in other places or spaces in their lives, or they could easily access them. What can't be used to deliver teleintervention services are any platforms that are public facing. So things like TikTok, Facebook Live, those things that are publicly facing, you wouldn't want to use for teleintervention. A couple notes about technology needs and what to do if you don't have access to a device or internet service. Many families already have the technology that they would need to participate in teleintervention. So, and the audio and video portion. So things like smartphones, a tablet, laptop, desktop computer, all of these things can be used to access these platforms. However, if you don't have access to a video platform, so maybe all you have is a phone and it's not a smartphone, it doesn't have video, or you use a landline, teleintervention can also be provided by audio only or by phone only. And we've heard some really unique stories across our state of folks that have been able to provide tele-intervention services in some real creative ways. You know, I think of some of the stories that I've heard of families who are Amish that are receiving tele-intervention services. So these families don't have phones in their homes. Some of them may have access to a phone off-site, you know, in their barn or a neighbor. And it's amazing that people have been able to be creative and figure out ways that these families can still receive services. If you are one of those families, or again, if you know of a family, we have a lot of folks on here that have connections with other families who don't have access to a device or internet service, we really encourage them to share that information with their early intervention preschool team or their program, their preschool program. There are other community agencies that are helping to provide devices to families. And there are numerous internet service providers that are offering free service during this time. Early intervention is not able to purchase devices or internet services for families for the purpose of tele-intervention, but certainly what programs can do is work with the family to see if they can find another way for them to access it. And, you know, right away get started on, but what can we do with what we have available now? So even if that's just a phone, they can be provided in that way. So when you think about what early intervention services might look like for you during this time, we wanted to give you just a couple ideas of how to think about your child's services. And one of the things that I strongly recommend as a parent myself with a kiddo who went through early intervention is to recognize that although all of the outcomes and goals that you had on your child's IFSP, IEP before COVID-19 are important, we also recognize, and hopefully, you know, you can give yourself a little bit of grace to recognize that your life may have become filled with other things that are also really important. And so thinking about, of those goal and outcome statements, what is most important at this time? And again, for your family, that may be everything. For some families, it may be some things. For some families, it may be, you know, there are just other priorities right now that have just moved to the top that we need as a family to be able to focus on. Any of those, you know, anywhere on that continuum is acceptable. We know that services and supports that you're able to engage in at this time may look different than before COVID-19 and may look different than after COVID-19, and that's okay. So we don't want folks to feel like what you need to do is set up a preschool environment in your home so that your child is receiving, you know, the same number of hours as they did before. We don't want your early intervention services to be causing additional stress and anxiety during this time. But what you may want to think about is, of those outcome and goal statements that are really important to you, what are the routines and daily activities that you have now? Again, they might look different than they did before. And if they have changed, how might those changes impact how you are able to work on those goals throughout the day? You might need a little bit of help of figuring out, so what activities would be best for me to work on these goals that my child has? You may be finding that there may be some new opportunities. There might be folks in your home now that typically aren't there that might be able to help support your child in those goals. So whether it's an older sibling or a partner or a spouse that typically isn't home during sort of the preschool hours, but now is going to be able to be home and might be able to participate in early intervention services and supports in tele-intervention, excuse me. So think about that. Are there people or other opportunities that may have been created? It also may be that, you know, you have some current challenges or some new challenges or concerns that maybe you didn't have before this, but now that you're all home and your child's routine has been upended, maybe you're realizing there are some new things that you might need to navigate. And again, those would be things to talk to your early intervention preschool program about. And do you have family priorities that are different than they might have been before? So in addition to the priorities for your child's learning and development, what priorities do you have as a family, and could that impact your ability to engage in teleintervention services? And if you find yourself identifying a lot of challenges and ways that you're just not quite sure how this is going to work with your family, we really encourage you to talk to your child's early intervention team or folks in early intervention about that. Because there are challenges or there may be barriers doesn't mean that you can't still access early intervention services and supports. If teleintervention is new to you, which I'm sure it is because it's new to all of us, and you're just not able to sort of figure out what should that look like or what could it look like, it's okay to say, you know, I really want to support my child in this area and I'm just not quite sure what to do right now or how to do it. You know, sharing some of that information and your concerns with your early intervention team during this time could really help you prepare for these services. So I'm going to run through just a couple tips and tricks before I turn it back over to Carl to share a little bit about what to do if you have questions or concerns. But first, I want to just share a little bit of how to prepare for these types of services. So together with your early intervention provider, you can talk about what platform you'll use and how services may be delivered. Know that if this is new to you, it is perfectly acceptable to ask to do a test run. In fact, your provider may welcome that as well, because for many providers, this is going to be new to them. The figuring out of the when and where of the session, obviously the where will be somewhere within your home, but is it the dining room? Is it the kitchen? Is it the living room? Is it the playroom? Those would be helpful things. And again, thinking about what routines would help support your child's learning and development. A little bit about audio and video, big picture, just do your best. We encourage you, I encourage you to test out using your video. Your early interventionist being able to see you interact with your child will be very, very beneficial in getting the most out of the session. Understandably, some folks are just not going to be comfortable that or not going to have that option, and that's okay. You can do this just over the phone. But again, we don't want you to feel like you have to set up some environment that's not typical for your family. If toys are usually strewn across the floor in the playroom, you might want to move a few over so you have a place to sit. But there is no need to create, you know, an unnatural environment in your home. We know that teleintervention is going to happen with families in the places and spaces they're inhabiting now. And we encourage you to let that be what it is. And that's probably one of the best ways to get the most out of early intervention teleservices at this time. We do have some tips for families that can be found again on that EITA website. So we are going to, we certainly suggest that you go to eita-pa.org. You can put that in the chat box. A couple more things. Please feel free to move around during your session. We don't want you to feel like you have to be stuck in the same spot. So it is certainly acceptable to start a session at your dining room table and maybe you move to the playroom. Again, that's going to be easier done if you have a mobile tablet or phone or something like that that you can use. If it doesn't work within the session, don't feel like every time you schedule, you know, teleintervention with provider A that it has to be in the same space. Instead, let the routines and activities that make sense to support your child's learning and development that you're working on be what drives where it happens in your house. We encourage you to try new strategies and give feedback, both you and the interventionists that you're working with. What's working, what's not working. And please let your early interventionists know if you need a little bit of help with figuring out So what are daily routines and activities that I can be using to work on this? If you need help with choosing, what are some fun repetitive activities to help you problem solve and help you to support plans in between sessions? So I think we're going to skip this poll. We're going to come back to it later because I want to have a chance to turn it over to Carl for him to talk a little bit about, so you had a chance to think about services, you have them in place or you're getting them in place. What do you do next?
Hi, everybody. I wanted to talk, before I start talking about the information from this slide, got a number of chats in the chat box about just some experiences that people are having and the differences of experiences. Some people feeling that they're getting a lot of success with the tele-intervention. Some feel it's limited, it's based on its service type. And we would expect that. And specifically in preschool early intervention, a lot of the staff have been familiar with working in classrooms as supporting classroom teachers, if it was a pre-K or Head Start program. And a lot of that was done in person work, as opposed to transitioning from that type of work and working in some type of a classroom to trying to do that individually in a tele-intervention over a platform. So just like you are learning, and what I've seen in the chat room, a lot of parents that were responding in the chat box, we're talking about learning and making a decision about whether or not they'd use this for the first time. Your teachers are also learning, and your preschool professionals are also learning of how to adapt to that environment as well. First, I wanted to cover some of the things that you can expect regarding documentation during this period. An overview of services and support that are offered and what, as a family, you are engaging in regarding your child's services should be documented and provided to you in writing. This is referred to as a written notice. Please note that tele-intervention can begin as soon as you have a plan. They do not need to wait until the program is able to send out that written notice. Just like before COVID-19, your preschool professionals will be tracking your child's progress, and that can take many forms. In fact, there was a question in the chat room that the person felt like there wasn't quite enough information in their session notes, and it seemed to me that they had an electronic system to report those session notes. I think that's like the other things that Sarah was talking about in terms of flexibility or comfort level of talking to your professional, your EI professional, about potentially expanding those notes if it's helpful, and really to help you make decisions or determine if the child's making progress. So those are things that I think to have that dialogue with your EI professional. The other question comes up, and I've kind of seen it alluded to in some of the chats, is what if I change my mind about what we've already decided? And we all know that our lives have been disrupted and turned upside down, and what was possible yesterday may not be tomorrow. We also know some families are concerned about access to food and shelter, and that's their primary need right now, or it may become their need next week. So it's understandable that you may decide or may have a change in decision. If your situation changes and you need to or wish to revisit your services during this COVID-19, reach out to your preschool early intervention professional. We've heard that so many of them have been helping connect to resources in your communities. That seems to be a place, and I think that represented in the first poll, was that a number of our programs have really begun that started to reach out to families. That next phase is beginning that intervention, the service delivery, making decisions about that. And as they get to that, beyond that phase, it's been really intentional, planned instruction as an expectation for our programs. But again, each of those programs are evolving and changing as they begin to work with their staff. So again, if your situation changes, just ask your staff to revisit it. If you decide not to move forward with services at all, and you want to make that decision, or you've made a decision to start and then decide not to, We encourage you to feel comfortable in asking that your preschool professional reach out to you periodically based on your schedule and what would work for you, so that if you would like time for the services to change, we encourage you to support the method or how often that services can work. So again, I think it's just feeling comfortable talking to your preschool early intervention professional about what you need. If you don't want to do service now, but maybe call me in a week, maybe call me in 2 weeks to check in to see if I'm ready to start at that point. Think about what you feel would be helpful. As you know, your EI professional is struggling with the same issues as you, having their children at home, as well as others in your community. As Sarah said, we're all in this together. We're all learning a new method, a new way of doing early intervention. And so that the services are really impacted by what's going on around our environments. If you have questions or concern about your child's services or supports, as a first step, we always ask you to reach out to your EI professional. If you know who their supervisor is, that would be the next line. If you're not getting a hold of anybody, and we saw someone in a chat that had some problems getting a hold of a supervisor within the early intervention program or getting a hold of the program at all, we've included on the chat box, I had done that, and maybe Gina can include it again. There is an email account that you can email one of my bureau staff. We'll follow up with you and then follow up with the program to see if they can facilitate a resolution to the problem. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And for the group, I just have to leave. I have a 3 o'clock call that I have to get on to actually discuss this very issue with some of the early intervention leadership. So thank you.
Thanks, Carl. So I know we're getting to the end of our scheduled time. So we have a few polls that I want to do, but I'm going to save them to the end. So I'm going to get through all of our content. But for those of you that are able to stay on, particularly our family members that are with us, if you're able to stay on, we would love to invite you to stay through the polls after I get a chance to share just some more resources. So if you have questions just in general about COVID-19 in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania's management or what's happening in Pennsylvania, the Department of Health, as Tracy mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, is the lead in Pennsylvania. And their website has a wealth of information. So if you haven't went there yet and you have questions, I encourage you to do that. The next website that we have is our Department of Education website in Pennsylvania. They also have a wealth of information. If you also have children in school and maybe you want to know what type of guidance are school districts getting at this time, I would encourage you to visit that website. We've mentioned numerous times on this information session the early intervention sort of spot for COVID-19 information and services during this time is our Early Intervention Technical Assistance Portal. Again, that's www.eita-pa.org. It's a great place if you just want to know what's happening or keep up to date with guidance that's being provided. It's also where this webinar and the infant toddler one will be posted later. PDE has done a great job, I think, of weeding through the large amount of information that's geared towards families around how to talk to their children about COVID-19. And we put a direct link to where you can get those resources on the PDE website. Give folks a minute. Again, this PowerPoint will be posted, but if you want to try to get there now, feel free to take a picture or a screenshot of the web link. A couple other places where you can go for additional support or information. Parent to Parent of Pennsylvania is still taking referrals and is still connecting families that have children with disabilities or special needs with other families. They are available across the state of Pennsylvania. If you haven't utilized Parent to Parent of Pennsylvania before, and you would like to talk to another family who's in a similar situation, I encourage you to reach out to them. If you have used Parent to Parent before, and again, you're in a place where you feel like you need some additional support, they would be a great resource for you. The Pennsylvania Department of Human Services also has opened up a support and referral helpline, and that number is there as well. It's 1-855-284-2494 for those of you that might just be on the phone. And this information and referral line was set up specifically to help address concerns that people may have that are related to COVID-19. We understand that this situation may be causing some anxiety, depression, just concerns with people. And so we encourage you to use that number if you find that you could use some support to help navigate that. And they will help connect you to resources in your community. The Peel Center, again, is another place in Pennsylvania, another center that has done a wonderful job of supporting families and gathering information for families about what's available and information about COVID-19. So I encourage you to check out the resources they've compiled. PA Promise for Children has some resources that are specific more towards early childhood. So if you're looking for those, you can find them there. And then again, this is the same website for childcare locations that are operational at this time. So if you have additional questions at this time, I encourage you to go ahead and put them in the chat. We will remain, staff will remain on the chat for a little bit longer after we end today to respond to those questions. So if your question hasn't been responded to or you have a question now, feel free to chat. For our professionals that joined us, at this point, we're just going to do a couple more polls for families. So you are welcome to step off and get on with the rest of your day. For families, we have a couple polls for you. So we want to know what additional information would be helpful to you to get more out of teleintervention services. And for this, you can choose multiple things. And again, this is just for families that are currently have children in preschool services. Give folks a little bit of time to respond. And the answers to these questions will help us guide efforts in terms of what other resources or information we need to provide to families, or if we want to continue these types of information sessions for families, what might be content that we would cover. I see folks are still responding, so we'll give folks a little bit more time to respond, and then we'll share the poll. Give folks about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to stop the poll. If you didn't have a chance to share your thoughts, you can feel free to share them in the chat as well, or if you couldn't access the poll. We will be saving the chat and going through that, so feel free to use the chat as well. But it looks like more help on how to create routines, activities while we're staying at home is definitely something that folks may be interested in. Sounds like folks are feeling like they just need to get a little bit of time under their belt and have a little bit of chance to work through these teleintervention services, and then they think they'll feel a little bit more comfortable. We have a group of folks that are already, comfortable with the way things are going. A little bit more help with how they can access devices or internet services. And more information about how to use the technology. That certainly makes sense. So great, thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna let Gina share what I believe is our last poll. Thanks so much. So this is really just, we want to get your sense for how this went for you today, if we answered your questions or not. And again, if there's additional information that you want to provide to us or you want us to know about what would be better or more helpful, feel free to put that in the chat, but I'll give folks a chance to respond to this. And for those of you that this wasn't the best format to get information, or perhaps you had questions that we didn't answer, please feel free to use the chat and let us know what would work better for you. Let me give folks a few more seconds. It looks like folks are still responding. Give folks about 10 more seconds and then we'll close out the poll and show you the results. Okay. So here we go. It seems like for most of the folks, they were able to get their questions answered, or at least some of their questions answered. Again, for those of you that didn't get your questions answered, please let us know what they are and we can try to address them either now through the chat or through another resource or perhaps another information session. So we have some ideas of, if we do this again, what we might want to focus on. So other supports outside of EI definitely seems to be something folks might want us to spend a little more time on. And again, if this format didn't work for you, please let us know what would be better. That would be great. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. We are going to wrap up our formal presentation. We will stay online for a little bit longer just to answer questions through the chat. But we are done our content. But thank you so much for joining, and we appreciate you taking your time out of your day. Bye, everyone.